Dun dun da 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 da. It's the Italian-Ottoman War by Decision Games. So we're gonna do a playthrough here. I'm probably gonna get some rules wrong and mispronounce some things, just a disclaimer up front. And also filming on like an iPhone, so it's not gonna be the best camera work, so you have to just kind of bear with me here. But this is the Decision Games that came with S&T issue 325, the November-December issue from last year. And I've done a couple playthroughs just with the basic standard rules, and for this one I'm going to be doing the advanced rules, which thankfully are not actually that much. It's just some rules about Egypt to British forces, a couple extra things. I'm using the optional deployment for the Ottomans so that they have their these full strength 4-4 infantry divisions. They have 4 of them instead of their normal 3-4. Other than that, there's not a whole lot else. A couple minor rule changes here and there. I'm not going to go super in depth in there. So this is the start of the game. I've already done the setup and I rolled for action points, which are kind of the main resource for the game. So this uses I think they call it's pronounced Windhoek, I think. Windhoek system, which they developed for that kind of World War I fight in German West Africa. So it's a pretty interesting one. It's got some fun rules with battle band stuff. We'll see all that when we do the main play. I'm not going to go into super depth about it, but so this is the starting situation. I've already done all the setup, and I'm going to kind of go into my thinking for each one here. So the Italians, not much to do. They're waiting around to do some amphibious assaults. And for them, there's kind of a choice here on whether they try to concentrate everything onto one coast first or split it up like they did historically. I think I'm going to elect to split it up this time too, although I only started with 8 action points for the first turn. There's no event phase, which we're going to show you this little charts here. So we have the Italians and the Ottoman event tables. So for the first turn, the Italians do not have any events. They don't have their reinforcement turns, their AP generation. That's all for post the first turn. Initially, they just need to get onto the board, basically. So I think I will end up splitting them. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to split them both on the first turn or wait till the second turn where they're going to get a nice crop of free reinforcements. Maybe I'll do it on the second turn. I'll hit maybe Serencia over here. But at the very least, the first turn for sure, I need to strike near Tripoli. Tripoli and Benghazi are worth more victory points than just the regular coasts. But hitting those coasts is going to be really important. And the reason why I want to do it for both, because the main generation for action points in the future for the Italians is controlling port towns. Controlling them gets them half a point. Port towns with bases gets them 1. So I really need to start getting in there and entrenching as soon as possible. Getting bases up and running so that I have a steady stream of action points. Otherwise, I have to rely a lot on random chance here with the event table. The Ottomans, and also depriving those bases deprives the Ottomans of action points in the beginning. So they have that from controlling those ports and port towns with bases as well. Though also oases with bases, but there's not going to be a lot of that yet. And then of course the event table. So depending on how these kind of roll in the second turn is also going to change a lot about how to react. But for the Turks, my basic setup I did for them is I have 2 kind of flying columns here. One in Tripoli, which is meant to be more of a defensive force to hold this and prevent the Italians from just doing an immediate amphibious invasion. Because I think the Italians still could, and they would probably win, but they might take a lot of losses in the process. And early on, when there's potentially not a lot of action point generation, that can severely hamper the Italian progress on that. So they're probably going to try to avoid that. Probably a more likely land at Misurata, and then start setting up from there and kind of push towards Tripoli and the coast. Potentially the force here at Tripoli could get reinforced on the Ottoman turn and maybe even strike back, depending on how well the Italians do, because when I get into it and how the turns work and the action points work, you'll see how they can you can get a pretty strong rhythm with a force, just as long as it doesn't get too damaged from combat and just kind of keep pushing and pushing. So that could certainly happen. But units aren't very fast in this game. And part of that you can see from the distance, it's a pretty far like mileage going on here. And there's not really roads, so these are tracks which do cost half a movement point to move across, which helps a bit. But otherwise, most units aren't very fast, except for cavalry and there's a few motorized units that the Italians can get access to. But other than that, not a lot going on here. It takes a while, and it takes a lot of resources to move great distances in a single turn. And that can be a problem, because if you're not generating enough resources quick enough, or you're just unlucky on your events table, that can drastically slow down operations. And this is not a particularly long game. There's 10 turns maximum, possibly only 9, depending if the Italians decide to try to take Turkish possessions in the Aegean, which they probably will try it because it's a pretty useful thing to do. It gives you potentially a lot of victory points. But we'll get to that when we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Second column here, we have a second Turkish column in Benghazi, which is another major victory point city. And this is meant to be more of a reaction force to actually counterattack. So we look at their composition here. We have Mustafa Kemal, future Ataturk. He's sitting here with a supply wagon as well. Supply wagons are important. Not only do they sustain units in the field if they're not in a friendly town or oasis or port for the supply phase, they can also be expended to give a combat bonus. So that's part of why he has that as well, despite being in a port city. Same for Tripoli. They can expend that to help him when fighting off the Italians. Anyway, so he has a pretty sizable force here, and it's meant to counterattack and to potentially start setting up bases as well, potentially. Probably we'll try to get one in Benghazi if possible, and then I want to try to move him at some point here, probably to Sirte to get a base going. And we'll try to get all of that stuff going along. I also like to get some engineers around to start setting up bases down in the oases in the south here. But that'll be probably more of a turn 2 to 3 type deal. In the meantime, what they're going to do in Benghazi is to potentially counterattack Italian forces that land near Tripoli, because they can spend this. But the problem here that the Ottomans are most likely going to have, and I'm going to use Turks and Ottomans interchangeably, just in my speech patterns, is that they got a bad roll for their starting AP amount. They only have 2. Now, they will generate a little bit on their first turn, because they actually do roll on the events table and do their normal AP generation. So they will get more and likely be up higher, but potentially it can hamper them a bit. We'll see. Depending on how well the Italians do at taking the Tripoli coast here and occupying, for instance, this oasis and stuff, and robbing the Turks of some more points, might be a little bit dicey. But we'll see how it goes. The other thing they might be able to do here is provide either a blocking force or even a counterattack on turn 2 when the Italians land either at Tobruk or Derna. Now, I have elected not to put units in there because from at least playing with the standard rules, and perhaps I'm just playing wrong, that's a very likely possibility as well. Splitting up, diffusing your force like that is just not a good idea, especially in the early game when the Italians are going to be more concentrated. It might make more sense later on, but for the moment, it's not a good idea. And diffusing your force in general is just not a good idea in this game, because the way combat works, if you have a smaller force, or even the same size force, but slightly better leadership or something, for example, the presence of leaders, can drastically alter how combat goes with battle advantage. Whoever has the battle advantage gets to fire first and deal out hits before the defender, or if the defender has the advantage, then before the attacker. the person with the advantage lends out hits first is the point, before the opponent even calculates their combat strength to roll. So that can be a severe problem here, even if you might overall have a larger force. Certain factors in there, for instance, if a unit is disrupted, then even just one will alter how the roll on the combat advantage. So if all of your units are in good order on the combat advantage roll, then you get a and they have to all be units that project a zone of control. So static units like militia don't work for it. But if all of your force are regular units that exert a zone of control, you get a +1 to your roll. So having even just one unit that's disrupted cancels that out. So that becomes a problem too. If your forces are damaged and spread out, you can end up almost snowballing in an attack where your forces are out there and they just keep getting picked off. Because there's also no limit to the amount of moves that a force, and by force in this game terms means any stack of units being activated, can go as long as you have action points to spend. So if I had 12 action points on the Turks, I could keep moving around Kamal, basically 12 times. So you can get a lot of tempo with even like single stacks that are powerful, and so that's why you want to kind of keep stuff together mostly. Granted, you're going to have to diffuse a little bit if you're the Italians, because you need to try to occupy these oases and these towns as fast as possible. At the very least, by the end of the game, you need to have as much as you can occupied in order to score enough victory points to win. So they have a kind of a thing here where they need to hold the coasts because they need that to generate action points, have to hold the coasts and keep enough forces in the coasts to prevent an Ottoman counterattack from the interior, while still trying to push into the interior themselves to capture these oases. And so that becomes the kind of the push and pull back and forth along the coastal action, back into the interior, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, Italian troops are pretty self-explanatory. You got regular forces. These orange guys are colonial troops. They have a slightly different cost for recruitment, and they can kind of be used a little slightly differently. They also have these camel supplies, which are pretty interesting, pretty useful for desert operations. They're just kind of a different way of getting troops to the field. Excuse me, and keeping them out there to garrison duty and fighting these. The light infantry are pretty good. They also tend to move faster, which is probably the most important aspect, really. They move faster despite having slightly less combat power in a lot of instances than the Italian troops. So that's a big deal. They can keep up with the Turkish and especially with the tribal and Sensui units, which are the important part here. So that's the three types here we have. We have Turkish Regulars, which a lot of them, not all of them, but most of them can't be replaced if they're destroyed. So the Turks will eventually lose that combat power just from attrition unless they completely avoid battle, which isn't really an option. So their regular infantry and stuff will eventually get removed from the game. Then they have tribal units. It's the brown here, and then I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's Senussi, I think is how it's pronounced. So the Senussi tribesmen / kind of religious Bedouin forces or Sahara forces, I'm not exactly sure on what their origin point is in the world, but they're in the Sahara and in the Libyan interior, and they operated out of these kind of religious madrasas that were out near these oases that are out here. So they can eventually come into play. Put the Uprising Markers in the Uprising box. So they can eventually come into play, but that requires an event. That's once the Senussi rebellion happens, they get a bunch of units that get deployed, plus a base here, and then after that they can be recruited like normal units. But for the moment, they can't really use them. As you can see, this jihad also recruits that number of tribal units, the brown guys. Now, one thing in the rules that isn't explicitly clear, at least not that I could find, is whether tribal units can be recruited during the regular phase by the Turkish player. I've been playing it that they can be. I'm not positive if that's correct, but it does feel correct when playing it. So I'm going to continue doing that for this playthrough. If someone who knows that the rules for this sees this video or sees the series can inform me if that's correct or not, please do. Though likely for this playthrough, I'm going to play with that in effect. It just feels weird to not, in some of the rules on the recruits table, like I'm sure they're there because of the Sensusi too, but it also feels weird to have the recruitment rules there in the beginning and it not apply to the tribe. So it's kind of awkward to playing it without tribes being recruitable as regular units feels weird. And it also wouldn't make a lot of sense if say the Italians succeeded in their Aegean operation, which stops regular Ottomans from being recruited. Then if the Senussi rebellion hasn't happened, the Turks have no ability to recruit, and that doesn't seem to make sense to me. It seems like they should be using the tribesmen still to fight guerrilla operations like they did historically. Which is why I recommend that S&T magazine. It's a great... in fact, I'll even link the magazine in the description of this video. It's a really good overview of the conflict and kind of goes into that. Anyway, so that's kind of the basic overview of the strategic situation. Oh, another thing here. Algeria and Tunisia are shown on the board. They can't actually be gone into. They're just there. Egypt is part of the advanced rules. So Egypt, only the Senussi units can enter it. However, that has some repercussions. That'll trigger the British units, which are off map right now, will come into play under Italian control. It adds some AP generation to both sides, though it favors the Italians. And it means that the British units can operate in Egypt and fight the Senussi units that come into play. Italian units can then attack over. They can enter Egypt, but they can attack over. It's just, I don't think it's a good idea for Senussi necessarily to do that, but it might come in handy. We'll see. I'm not quite sure when or if it's a good idea to do so, but it might happen. So I guess we'll see how it goes. Oh yes, and another thing here, these uprising markers. So the Ottomans can purchase these uprising markers to use. In fact, you know what? I'm actually going to keep them in the recruits tab until they're purchased, then I'll move them over to the uprising marker box. But they're useful for dealing with Italian units that are on oases or towns. So if the Ottomans attack, they can expend an uprising marker if they have one available, and it negates the terrain advantage. If it succeeds, they have to roll. They have to do a dice roll. But if it succeeds, it negates the terrain advantage and gives them a +1 to the right on the combat results table for when the Ottomans roll, which that would be an attack. So when they're attacking, so that's potentially very useful here. And that's kind of the gist of it. And I think I'll pick up with another video. We'll probably do turns 1 and 2 because those are probably going to be relatively quick at the start because it's just going to be landings and some fightings along the coast. And I think that's what we'll go with for now. So this should be a good one. All right, stay tuned.